Well, it's been about 6 months since I last added a video to the engine building series. I have to say it's a lot more challenging than I thought. So while I unpack my latest power tool purchase, I'll explain what I'm about to do. Basically, I'd like to learn how a gearbox works and how to do a basic recondition on one. So Paul Jeffries, an engine builder himself, agreed to a bit of an experiment that I thought up, and that was to see if it was possible to talk someone through the process via FaceTime with both of us living over 100 miles apart. For Paul, rebuilding a gearbox is a fairly straightforward task, but as we found out, guiding someone with no experience remotely via a mobile phone has its challenges. Now I have to say at this point, this isn't intended to be a tutorial of any kind. There's already videos out there showing how to recondition gearboxes. This is purely just a video for anyone that's interested in either following the progress of Smugwood Mini, or for anyone who might be interested to see what's involved in taking a mini gearbox apart. So here's Paul on the other end of the phone. He's not got the best angle to see what's going on, as I didn't exactly buy myself the most expensive phone tripod, and he really had no idea what he's letting himself in for at this point. But here's the gearbox that we're going to recondition. First job was to remove this portion of the gearbox. Now I'm pretty sure that this is the diff, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Now obviously if Paul was doing the work, he'd be using all the correct tools for the job, but as my tools are limited, I had to make do with what I had to hand. Removing this casing was a case of flattening several locking tabs and removing the bolts, which were quite tricky to do because the gearbox is very light and tended to rock when I was applying force. The bolts came out fairly easy and didn't cause too much of an issue, although one bolt did look like it wasn't standard, and I'm wondering if the gearbox had previously been messed with, as some of the bolts didn't quite feel torqued up. I tapped the housing off, which I'm guessing is the inner drive shaft housing, and Paul explained that there'd be a spring to remove and a ball bearing, which I had to remove with a thin magnetic stick, and as with everything that I removed, it was all bagged up as not to lose anything. There's also a rubber to remove and a collet which came out fairly easy. The cover at the other end was a little trickier to remove. The bolts came out easy enough, but the cover was well and truly stuck on, so I had to use a piece of lead wood to gently tap it off. Removing the diff housing was a bit time consuming too, but this was my fault. Paul had told me exactly what to do, but I'd misheard him and I'd accidentally nudged the camera so that he wasn't able to see what I was doing. Eventually I resorted to a bit of violence and it came off, but it was really stuck on there. Paul informed me that it was a 3.44 final drive, or at least I think that's what he said. To remove this bracket I had to use an impact screwdriver. Now I'd not used one before, so I wasn't sure which way to set the settings and the writing was very difficult to see, but eventually it worked the screw loose. The bolts came off easily enough and the bracket was removed and bagged. Then I removed the speedo drive, which was simple to remove, and this may need to be changed later on once I've worked out what wheels and the clocks I'll be using. Removing this cover was again fairly straightforward, but did require a good wiggle to remove it. These next bolts are for the oil pickup. Now, I haven't removed the spacer as I didn't realise at the time that it came off, but regardless I was now able to remove the oil pickup pipe. Now this next process was to lock the gears in place so that a nut could be removed, but poor lighting and focus from the phone meant it was difficult for Paul to see exactly what I was doing, so it took a while for me to understand what to do, but eventually I did manage to lock off the gears. Now I believe this nut can be a pain to remove, but after knocking flat the locking tab and using the rattle gun for the first time ever, it was a breeze to remove it. Then it was just a case of removing this gear. This next bit was tricky because again it was difficult for Paul to see what I was doing. We also kept losing connection, but eventually I was able to remove the piece. Next there was a circlip to remove and then this little bearing to disassemble. The magnetic stick really came in handy here when removing the bearings. This did take some time and was quite fiddly. Now, out of the entire strip down, this was probably one of the trickiest parts of all. I didn't have a bearing puller to remove the bearing, so access to the nut was quite tricky. The locking tab was also really solid, and I was bashing it with a cheap screwdriver and a crappy hammer. Now Paul did come up with several suggestions, but my lack of tools was really letting me down. He said that if I can loosen the nut with a socket, we could potentially use it to partially remove the bearing, and hopefully it can wiggle itself off. The problem was the socket that I had was cheap and nasty, and it was rounding the nut off with the force of the impact driver, but eventually it did seem to work itself loose, and I was able to remove the bearing from the shaft. It was actually quite stressful filming the video because I was having to move Paul around the room and my camera around the room, and with oily hands I was trying not to damage any of the cameras, but nothing was as stressful as trying to remove this circlip. This has got to be one of the strongest, springiest clips I've ever seen, and it must have taken me over an hour to get this off. I've edited most of it out so it's not a 3-hour video, and also because I swore more times than Limp Bizkit on his hot dog song. Once it was off, this is where I messed everything up. Now Paul had told me exactly what to do, but because he couldn't see me and I'd knocked the camera again by accident, I ended up hitting the wrong shaft, which resulted in problems later on with the bearing. But anyway, eventually I removed the correct shaft and was able to withdraw some of the gears. Now because I'd hit the wrong shaft, I dislodged a bearing, which meant that I couldn't insert a special tool that Guessworks make for removing this shaft. I think I got a little frustrated with my stupidity and was wiggling everything in the hope that I could get all the shaft out, but the more I messed with it, the more it fell to pieces and springs and ball bearings were flying out everywhere. Fortunately, Paul's a lot more professional than I am and came up with a solution for fixing what I'd done wrong. And after reseating the bearing, I was able to use a Guessworks tool on the shaft and tap out the bearing, which I'm assuming that I've knackered. Now because all the pieces on the shaft had somehow separated, it was almost impossible to remove it from the gearbox. I placed Paul over the gearbox to have a look and guide me through the process, and eventually I got it out. But then my phone battery went flat, my camera ran out of memory and I had to stop filming. After charging everything up, the next day I was able to carry on filming. I managed to find the pieces that flew out using the magnetic stick, and after dropping out the roll pin, I was able to remove the shaft which holds the selectors. Then there was just a couple of nuts and bolts and I was pretty much finished. So now it's just on to cleaning everything up and working out what I'm going to need to put everything back together.